What happens if you buy a new multifamily property and after closing you realize you have no leases, you have no keys, or maybe you've closed on it and you got all the leases and one of your tenants is ready to move out and you say, great, here's your $1,000 deposit, because that's what your lease says, and the tenant goes, wait a minute, what are you talking about? I had a $1,500 deposit and I can prove it. But when you closed on it, the landlord only gave you, or the seller only gave you $1,000. These are a couple of the scenarios that you can run into when purchasing a multifamily home. How do you prevent these from happening? I'm SandiWarner with Warner Realty Group. One way that you can set yourself up for success when you're purchasing a multifamily home that already has tenants in it is to get a tenant information sheet filled out by the tenant and signed off by the landlord, the seller. Yes, when you're purchasing a multifamily home, you're going to get copies of all the leases. A common scenario that we run into is a seller might inherit a multifamily home that their parents owned for years, and those tenants just kind of keep rolling over and over, and verbal agreements are made over the years, or maybe the tenant sublet to someone else and there's no documentation, and by the time you've closed and the seller's got his money and gone away and you've agreed to whatever security deposits you got at closing, you find out as time goes on all these little things come up. How do you stop this? The way you do this is you get a tenant information sheet filled out during your purchasing process. You present the listing agent, preferably during your offer phase, because sometimes listing agents get a little squirrely. You make it part of your offer that you have to have this signed and filled out by everybody, if you can. If not, you got to kind of insist on it during the closing. You have a right to this information. You're buying an investment property. You need this documentation. And actually, the purchase and sales agreement in Rhode Island has language that requires that you get this information. So I'm going to put up a document that we use here at Warner Realty Group. We represent several large-scale investors, and we purchase multifamily properties all year long for these same investors. There are lots of scenarios that we've run into, and we try to cover them in this document, and we're happy to share this with you. So coming up on your screen, this is an example of the information that we ask. Now, not all of this information is going to be relevant to every single purchase that you make. You want to edit this. You may walk into a scenario where you have meticulous bookkeepers. We do happen to have that sometimes. It's phenomenal. We love this. And those bookkeepers can, those record keeper type sellers, they'll have this information at their fingertips and they are eager to share it with you. Where you know you got problems is if you give this sheet to someone and everyone panics. The seller panics and the listing agent panics or the property manager panics. That's when you know you got bad record keeping and you need to get as much information as you can. Doesn't mean you can't get it after the sale. It's just going to save you time and get you up and running faster if you can get as much of this information up front. So you want to know the name of the actual tenant, who's responsible for paying you rent, and how do you get in touch with them. You want to know if they think they have a written lease. Maybe you're given a lease for these people, but the people in that unit think there is no lease. Doesn't mean that anyone's lying. It means you got a problem to solve. You got to figure out why one person thinks there is and one person thinks there isn't. You want to know what the tenant thinks their monthly rent is. A story we learned about that one was the sellers inherited the property and they got record keeping from mom, who was the bookkeeper, and she was under the impression that they were collecting $1,200 a month. But when we asked the question of the tenant had made a deal with son, and son had said, your son wants to be a big deal, right? He's the guy, and he's going to be the El Jefe. He's going to be the good guy, and he's going to give the tenant a break. So he told the tenant, that if you take the trash out and you mow the lawn, I don't have to do it. You only have to pay $1,000 a month. And somehow son was collecting the rent and mom had record keeping, and never the twain shall meet. And nobody knew that this was the deal. By asking the tenant, that this is happening. Doesn't make the property unacceptable to you. It just means you know what's going on. You want to ask when the rent began. You want to ask when the lease is going to end. Maybe somebody in the group has told them that they have a lifelong lease. If that's not in writing, you're okay, but you need to know this is going to be a problem. You want to know the name of everyone living in that unit. You don't want to find out that you've rented to, Joe the plumber, and by the time you get there, Joe has sublet to his sister, and his sister had 4 kids. And as the kids got older, the sister got married and she went and lived somewhere else. And now you're renting to 4 college kids, because that's not what you bought. So you need to solve that problem in advance. You want to find out when the rent's due. We all assume it's due on the 1st, but maybe your tenants, your new tenants, they get paid on the 16th, and this landlord has always let them pay on the 16th. Get this documented so you're not chasing them. Find out what the security deposit is. Maybe you're given a copy of an old lease and the seller says, oh, that's the only lease we have. And that lease says that your tenant has $1,000 security deposit. The seller has to give you that security deposit when you close on the building, but you come and find out that over the course of time, the tenant does have a copy of a later written lease in which he was required to add more to that security deposit. So when the time comes for that tenant to move out, he says, hey, you new buyer, I have documentation that I have a $1,500 security deposit that you owe me, and you only received $1,000 at closing. You're out $500. So make sure you know what that information is up front. Find out if the tenant paid their last month's rent. Landlord could say, oh yeah, everyone's up to date, because they don't want to scare you off, right? They want to make sure that you buy this property, only to find out that the tenant's honest with you and he says, no, I haven't paid rent in 2 months, and you're buying in the time of COVID and you can't get them out. These are things you have to know. What are some other questions you might want to ask? What utilities do you pay for? Maybe your seller's been paying their cable bill. Maybe your seller lives in one of the units and they've always let the tenant be on the Wi-Fi, but when you buy it, you're not using the seller's unit. You're going to rent it out, and now all of a sudden the upstairs tenant's screaming at you because they don't have Wi-Fi anymore. Not providing Wi-Fi, if it's always been done for a while, may well be viewed as a necessity in today's day and age. So don't get stuck on that. Make sure you know what's going on. Ask the tenant if they own any of the appliances. You might have gone through while the tenant was not there, and everyone in the group may assume that the landlord owns the garbage disposal. Well, more likely something like a stove or a refrigerator. One time we went into a unit and we could see that there was a newer stove and a newer refrigerator and a washer dryer. And the listing agent said these all belong to the seller, and the MLS said these all belong to the seller. Lo and behold, because we never talked to the tenant moves out, and tenant says, what are you talking about? That's my washer and dryer. Well, now you've got to replace that washer and dryer. In this scenario, the tenant was able to document it, that the washer and dryer failed. He had the emails back and forth with the seller, which the seller had, in all good faith, forgotten. And the tenant could prove that he had replaced them. You're now out, what's that, $1,100 if you replace it at a decent scale. What are some other things? Ask the tenant if they have a pet. Maybe you never saw the pet. Maybe they always walked the pet and you don't mind, but you need to know that because you have an insurance liability. Ask if the tenant's been allowed to smoke in that unit. Ask questions like, are there any other written agreements? Did the landlord tell you that you could renew, for the next 5 years at this price? Does that tenant have a text or an email saying that? Maybe the landlord forgot it. Maybe the landlord died and whoever took it over didn't know about that. So these are some agreements these are some questions you want to ask so that you can come out of the gate up and running when you take over your property. I'm Sandi Warner. We're here at Warner Realty, making the complex simple.